Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, especially anyone who's on the West Coast. Elisa, really appreciate it, where it is very early. If we haven't met, my name is Joel Reed. I am the Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Robotics Network. The PRN exists to connect you with the Pittsburgh robotics community, which is one of the largest and most important in the world. Many people know about Carnegie Mellon University's leadership in advanced robotics and artificial intelligence for research and education, but that success over the last decade has been translated into an important and growing commercial robotics ecosystem. Today, Pittsburgh has over 100 plus organizations that are working on advanced robotic solutions in aerospace, agriculture, healthcare, supply chain, retail, defense, and many more industries. We're no longer a well-kept secret, and the PRN is working to promote the region's strengths. We're creating critical business development connections, and we're creating new spheres of influence, all of this for the purpose of accelerating the overall adoption of autonomous solutions. I encourage you to please connect with us, get to know the Pittsburgh community better. You can visit robopgh.org, our website, so it's robopgh.org. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We're easy to find there. For today's webinar, we've partnered with Cushman and Wakefield to talk about real estate strategies, especially in this year of COVID and how things might change or stay the same post-COVID. Physical spaces can not only cost our businesses up to 10% of operating budgets, and sometimes on a fixed basis on long-term leases, but office design, employee amenities, and overall work culture affects our company's abilities to attract an increasingly demanding workforce. And then if you add in it for robotics companies, the requirements for mechanical design, electrical design, manufacturing capacity, the ability to test on site, perhaps do some sub-assembly or full assembly, it gets pretty complicated. And this is the aspect of starting and growing and operating a robotics company today. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And actually, I think Sam's going to mention I might join the discussion because we had someone who was unable to make it. I do want to remind folks that we have a Q&A capability. And so that will happen about after 45 or 50 minutes of panel discussion. How the Q&A goes depends on you as participants. Please ask questions. Use the Q&A feature. Not the chat feature. We're going to monitor this throughout and try to get as many questions as possible. So with that, I want to introduce and thank Sam McGill and Cushman and Wakefield. Sam is the Senior Vice President who's been there for almost 9 years now, and he's a key member in the Pittsburgh community. He's the person that helps us as companies navigate these important questions, help us develop our strategies, and put us on a path of executing them. Some people see this function as overhead, but real estate really is a strategic issue for enabling our company's growth and development. Sam has been tightly involved with our startup community, and he's advised tech companies, both large and small. So Sam, thank you very much. Thank you for your team and for helping us put this panel together. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, Jill, thanks. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to the PRN and provide some what I think is very timely insight and thought-provoking discussion around the topic of the day, which is affecting everybody, which is COVID-19. I know when you and I were talking about this early on and putting this together, one thing that I often considered, but since I'm not living it every day outside of having conversations with our clients, is that the robotics industry does touch every industry vertical now, and the in-person experience, the in-person environment is very critical to servicing clients, to servicing business, to developing the IP that subsequently is sent around the world from Pittsburgh, which is very exciting if you ask me. So part of the reason why Cushman & Wakefield and R3A wanted to do this was first and foremost make this educational for the Robotics Network and really provide some insights and thoughts to different perspectives in what we're seeing in the marketplace, not only in Pittsburgh but in other places of the United States and the world. Again, it's very relevant and timely content for what's going on in both the real estate industry and the world. We also wanted to connect Pittsburgh to the outside market as well. Elisa Konik, I'll introduce her in a second. It's 6:30 her time, so thanks again for joining. She's a thought leader in our emerging tech business here at Cushman and Wakefield. And going forward, we wanted to make sure that the robotics network really leaves this with strategies for growth, understanding better elements of design, and really developing workplace strategies that can lead to more productive outcomes in this new normal that we're living in. So the focus of today's conversation will be on three key topics, all that revolve around design and workplace strategy. So we're going to talk about the distributed workforce and what we're seeing there. We'll also talk about some space utilization strategies, and then where we see some of this going forward. And I think over the last 8 months, what our collective teams have determined is that, this isn't a binary solution. It's not one size fits all. Every business is different. But when you're in an industry that really needs in-person interaction and collaboration, these things become even more important than in some other industries that we work in. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the panel here and give you a sense of why they're on the panel, and then we'll kick things off. So again, I mentioned Elisa Konik. She's managing director and the chair of our emerging tech advisory group at Cushman Wakefield. She sits in our Bay Area office. She leads that group. She's responsible for bringing thought leadership and best practices to some of our firm's most dynamic technology occupiers. She advises clients on real estate strategy to ensure tactical occupancy decisions, support longer-term planning and client success. Her view on this panel will be from what I would call the real estate department, advising occupiers in the tech space and devising strategies on how to move things forward. Chris Gruendl, he's an associate principal with R3A Architecture here in Pittsburgh. His team was instrumental in developing Mill 19, which is in Hazelwood, which is where ARM is located. He's an architect. He's been in the business for 20 years, and he has experience in manufacturing, science and tech, workplace design. And he's immersed in a lot of I would say some of the cutting edge activity-based workplace design and integration of what we call Industry 4.0 technologies in the changing face of smart manufacturing. So I don't know if Elisa and Chris, you want to say hello before we get started and tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I think Sam did a pretty thorough introduction on me, but I've been at Cushman & Wakefield for about 13 years. I've helped clients kind of navigate their global real estate plans, typically for reasons other than the brick and mortar real estate. So helping them find the best talent pools, understand the cost for operating in a particular market, whether it's, attracting government incentives, lowering utility costs, understanding permitting challenges. So very dynamic industry we all find ourselves in, and I'm excited to be here. Obviously the world is changing and we're doing our best to stay on top of it all.
And I'm Chris Gruendl with R3A Architecture, and I just want to thank the Pittsburgh Robotics Network for having us on and allowing us to speak. We really appreciate that. And thank you for the introduction, Sam. As you kind of mentioned, Sam, I think that how R3A ended up in Industry 4.0 came from all that experience that you talked about there. So we had been working in traditional markets such as science and tech, both at the academic level and in the private sector. We've been working in manufacturing, traditional manufacturing, smart manufacturing, and workplace office design, as well as classroom and training in those type of typical spaces that you would see traditionally. As Industry 4.0 came along over the last 5 years, it started to become a term that we were using for this collective of bringing these different technologies into, whether it's a maker space or a digital innovation space. We started finding ingredients of all of these different, whether it's, something, a hood from a chemistry lab, machines coming out of machine shops next to a training classroom that we may find in an academic building. So, and then on the other side of the wall, you may have a piece of heavy manufacturing that is being retrofitted with sensors. So we're bringing things in from all of these different worlds. And I think that at R3A, we found ourselves in a fortunate place at the intersection of all those based on our experience. And we've really just I've really appreciated and enjoyed riding the wave of this industry as it's been picking up.
Thanks, Chris. So when we kick off the panel here, as Joel mentioned earlier, feel free to ask any questions that are relevant to the topic, and we certain to do our best to answer. So Lisa, we'll kick it off with you. So the first question: many employers are carefully managing capital spend in 2020 and prioritizing immediate retrofit reconfiguration plans as opposed to net new investments in workplace design. That said, many teams are starting to lay the groundwork by studying employee preferences, trends, and drafting interim policies so that they're in a better position to implement more transformational change in the future. What are some of the tactics you are seeing or advising firms to do to help manage spend, but still have a competitive workplace in this new normal?
Thank you, Sam. So I think obviously great question and certainly timely. It's one we probably are being asked to opine on every day. And I think you implied it within the question itself, but what we're seeing most often is actually teams laying the groundwork as opposed to investing in a major retrofit at present. I mean, I think those on the call who've gone through a construction project know that permitting takes time, construction takes time. And in order for someone to have had built out, a new space for this new normal, they would have had to have been in for permits probably in March or April and had incredible foresight. So we're still all learning together. And what I think that we're seeing is kind of three buckets for technology occupiers. Employee surveys is one, changing employee benefits, and then three is kind of rethinking workplace design. So going back up to the top on employee surveys, I think that we saw this be incredibly impactful in like the April, May timeline as people realized that we were going to be settling into this for quite some time. So for those on the call, many of you probably have conducted employee surveys. If you haven't, it might be a good time to consider it. I think a lot of really interesting lessons have been learned from those who've done it. Here at Cushman, we've actually conducted a survey across about 60,000 employees across our clients. So you can also take a look at some of that, some of the kind of aggregated surveys on how people are adapting and how they want to see their workplace evolve. There's also been some surveys that have been released anecdotally by some of the larger enterprise software technology companies, obviously a bit different from hardware and robotics, but the likes of Facebook and Google, they have released certain anecdotes. And some interesting nuggets I would say that we can all learn from is that I would say roughly about 50% to 60% of kind of Facebook and Google employees who answered surveys really wanted to be back in the office. Facebook actually came out and said, over 50% said they want to be back in the office full time, and that's how they want to work going forward. Google, when they conducted their surveys, they actually conducted them over a period of time to see how people's opinions of the workplace and remote working evolved. And what they saw is that about 50% of people at the very beginning of the pandemic in May wanted to be back in the office sometime, and that increased by 10% to over 60% of the workforce when taken again in July. So just a few months later, from May to July, they saw an increase. And I think we all kind of understand that the Zoom fatigue and the managing of childcare. I'm sure during the webinar today, you'll hear a little bit of my toddler in the background. Surveys, I think, are a really big factor here, and certainly encourage people to get a pulse on what their unique employees want. And then secondly, what we're seeing is employers reworking their workplace and employee benefits. In terms of workplace policies, this is that elephant in the room we've all been hearing about, greater long-term adoption of distributed working. Some industries are more primed to provide that amenity than others. But I do think that the technology sector at large is starting to offer some unprecedented level of flexibility to allow employees choice in where and how they work. So that's number one for kind of workplace policies. And then in terms of employee benefits, just more generally speaking, some of the benefits that we've been seeing implemented over the last couple of months, new work from home subsidies. Within the technology sector, we have been tracking this, and I'd say that roughly employers have been providing stipends, one-time stipends of about $500 to $1,500 per employee to help them with home office outfitting or other needs they may have. We've seen the introduction of First Fridays, so one Friday off a month for employees to focus on health and well-being. We're also starting to hear about new HR roles within technology companies who are always, amongst the most innovative sectors. So these new HR roles are things like a work from home facilitator or a director of employee well-being or a VR immersion coordinator. Some of these are a bit hypothetical and dreaming, but this is definitely something that we're taking a close look at. And then I think lastly, it comes down to the workplace design. And so based upon what people are hearing from their employees and how their workplace benefits and strategies have changed, then we're seeing people kind of pick up a pen and start to remap what the workplace is going to look like. And because I actually have a slide that speaks to some of these concepts, I'm just going to really quickly pull that up on screen here if y'all don't mind. Oh, you know what? Actually, it looks like I probably can't share my screen unless—
I got it for you. Go ahead.
Right?
Go ahead. You should be good now.
All right. Wonderful. Yep, I got that. All righty. So I'm just going to share this screen real quick. And if anyone's interested in any of these slides, I can share them with folks later. But it talks about some of the elements that we've been hearing across our technology clients in terms of workplace redesign. And again, a lot of it is still in the planning stages. Most specifically, we're hearing a lot more about retrofits and reconfigurations than gut renovations. And part of that is because A, we're not entirely sure how employees are going to want their workplace to be. And so people are a little bit nervous about investing in a ton of capital. And that people are also just very conservative on capital spend right now. When we think about retrofits and reconfigurations of space, this requires employers to perhaps move workstations to temp storage. Temporary storage here in the Bay, the demand is incredible. We see people marking unused desks to support either checkerboard patterns or at least promote some distance to support social distancing. And then we're definitely seeing folks rotate desks to de-densify. And there's actually a lot of really wonderful designs that some of the furniture vendors have provided. So if people are still looking for some ideas as to how to take their existing furniture, I would suggest going back to their original vendor. And you'd be surprised, they have been doing a really great job giving people some suggestions on how to rework their existing furniture, whether it's addition of panels or something else to make it easy for folks to reconfigure. And you can see some of those diagrams on the right-hand side, courtesy of Steelcase. But Steelcase is just one of many vendors who have done this kind of as a benefit to their customers. Promoting well-being, formal hand sanitizer stations throughout an office space. We also see folks laying out preferred modes and methods of travel, so ensuring that people use certain doors for entry and exit. And then prioritizing access for folks to natural light and outdoor access. So really kind of opening up any outdoor spaces for seating, perhaps even kind of actual heads down solo work where people, if they want to come into the office but prefer to do so in an outdoor environment. We've actually seen a couple of innovative tech employers here in the Bay where we have the benefit of some good climate, take advantage of that. And then variety in design and uses. So this is definitely a big topic. We are rethinking the kind of the neighborhood aspect of a floor plan. So how do we use a particular space to support unique types of work. And some of those types of work could be focus work, where it's heads down, and perhaps there's a portion of the floor plan that is dedicated to that specifically. And that has some of the more strict social distancing requirements. That's very easy to maintain because people aren't up and about. They're actually sitting down and working. Collaboration spaces, perhaps these, because they have people closer together, need to be in the most well-ventilated areas in the room, high ceilings, perhaps right near open areas, socializing, and then learning. When people were asked in some of the bigger employee surveys conducted during COVID-19, one of the number one reasons people wanted to come back to the office was socializing and learning. So making sure that we're dedicating space to those purposes, I think, is incredibly important. Phone booths, I think, have always been, a popular amenity for workplace design within the technology sector. We actually have seen an increased interest in the movable phone booths, so not, bolted down, not built into the walls, but phone booths as a furniture solution, because it allows people some more flexibility to provide private space. And some of these phone booths are ventilated with fans. So purchasing these phone booths, they can typically run about $3,000, $4,000 a pop. Lots of different vendors provide them. We'd also be happy to provide some recommendations on what's out there. That provides a lot of floor plan flexibility and also allows people to have their own private space. And then equipment and tech, I think we've all, early on in the pandemic, got a bit of a crash course in all the different types of web conferencing technology sets out there. It's more than just Zoom, but making sure that our conference rooms are video enabled. So if an employer is starting to support remote work, it's incredibly important that there's this seamless connection between those who are on site and those who are remote. Because the last thing you want to do is make those folks who chose to be remote, make them feel like they're not connected, or they're having a challenge hearing or speaking with people that are congregated on site in a conference room. So things like digital whiteboards, we definitely heard a lot about in March and April. I have yet to see a really great one. Would love to hear from those in the audience, maybe in the chat feature if they've seen one. And then integration of smart building features such as utilization sensors. That is a kind of re-entry into the dialogue. We've heard about this for years, but I think it's been unique at this point to see new demand. And then visitor management, people are kind of re-exploring, whether it's Envoy or other systems to better manage their visitors and handle contact tracing. And then the last thing that I'll talk to is hot desking. If there's one topic we hear more than anything else in terms of workplace design, it's unassigned seating. So if we're supporting more flexible work environments, how do we do that? There's a lot of technologies out there to support kind of unassigned desk seating allocations. And I think we're going to see that as a continued demand going forward. I know a lot of content there kind of packed in, but that's kind of some of the key elements that we're talking about relative to design. Sam?
Oh, thanks, Lisa. That was great. I mean, the workplace reimagined, I mean, we're all working through it at the present time, and it's something that, as I mentioned earlier, there's not a one size fits all solution. But in terms of, working through these things, I mean, that's great information and a great segue into Chris. We talked a little bit about some design elements as the expert on the panel in design. Are you starting to see any trends develop as a result of COVID-19, particularly in the robotics or the more in maker space?
Yeah, I think we can look at those trends on kind of two different time scales. So there's what's going on in the short term, and then what's going on in the long term. And as we just talked about, I think we just heard about the permitting aspect of it. The fact of it is, to move walls and reconfigure space, the time periods you're looking at are 6 to 9 months to a year to pull those permits. A new building is 2 to 3 years in design. So once we kind of settled into the pandemic and understood the time frame, I think a lot of companies started to realize it didn't make sense to do large scale renovations, moving a lot of walls around, because by the time you would finish that part of the process, we would be on the back end of the pandemic. So what we've seen in the short term is a lot of what we just, actually what you just talked about was what we would call space planning. It's reutilizing space in a different way. So we did a number of projects this summer for different clients, relaying their furniture out, especially in larger institutions where there's maybe multiple classrooms, offices, conference rooms, and taking floor plans of buildings that we've worked in or already designed, relaying those out with a new set of rules and guidelines that we're being given by those groups. So they've, different companies will adopt from the CDC, they'll take the CDC guidelines, they'll add on their own policies based on the the surveys of their workforce. And they'll, we'll take those and then we'll take all those rules that they want to do and we'll relay the space out for that. The other big interest we've seen in the short term is with the HVAC systems. There's been a lot of interest in trying to understand how to increase the ventilations in spaces, how to get better ventilation in spaces. You just talked about opening up doors and things like that. There's a lot of expense to that, but I think that people see a lot of long-term benefit in just creating a healthier environment. So in the second part of that, we look at the long-term impacts of these changes. And the trends we're seeing in some of the projects that we would call kind of on the boards right now, the ones that were in design while this started, we did not see people making large scale changes to their overall planning. So they weren't reconfiguring the building in a completely different way or reconfiguring a tenant space. What they were doing is a lot of kind of what we just discussed, which was a bit of short-term planning. So on the day one move-in, they understood, okay, this is how we're going to operate very short term. We realize it's going to be, months, 6 months, and then we'll start to phase into our original plan of how we wanted to use the space. Obviously, there's going to be some impacts from this that are going to kind of carry with us in terms of having healthier buildings in general for the long term. But I think from our process and how we typically work with clients, the process really didn't change very much. What we typically do is we sit down and talk with our clients about what do you need on day one, what do you need on year 1, year 3, year 10, and lay out a map of that. So putting together kind of a plan of space utilization, expansion, and change is a normal part of the design process. In this case, obviously, we have an acute situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has put some different considerations on the board and things that we've had to look at.
Oh, that's great. I mean, what are some of those considerations, Chris, if you can go in a little more detail? Maybe you said some of those already, but I think that'd be good for the audience.
For the longer term?
Yeah, sure.
So for the longer term, I think the biggest interest we see in trend is just simply toward healthier buildings, specifically indoor air quality and automation of doors, faucets, things like that create more touchless environment around you. So we realize that those type of things are common to a lot of respiratory diseases. It's not just COVID-19, and it could impact things like flu season and everything else that we deal with in an environment. So longer term, as we look at buildings, what I would expect to happen is that there's going to be a huge interest in changing how we design HVAC and how we deliver air in buildings. Traditionally, and we've seen these type of trends occur in the past. In the 70s, we had an energy crisis, which pushed us toward really thinking about buildings and the energy they consume, which eventually led to LEED certification and other certification programs to help encourage a change in the market in terms of what systems and materials are available. We've seen similar trends in the last 10 to 20 years involving daylighting and the recognition of the health benefits employees have with daylighting in those spaces. So I would expect we're going to see indoor air quality become kind of the next issue. And it's going to take many years to resolve with the design community, because many of the solutions that are needed have a lot of cost involved with them. So some of those solutions, one is ventilation. So bringing in more fresh air from the outside into a building is going to improve the quality of the air because we're not recirculating the same air. But there's significant challenges with that, because when you're bringing in air from the outside, especially in the winter or in the summer, you're bringing in very hot or cold air, and it takes a lot of energy to condition that air to get it to where you want to be in the building. So we'll have to think of that in terms of solutions of how we deal with having more ventilation, plus the energy saving strategies that we're already trying to implement. And we've dealt with that with natural light as well, because natural light brings heat into a space. So that's one aspect of it. We're going to need to look at how air is distributed in buildings. So right now, what you see in a lot of office space environments, places you would rent, is you see above ceiling mechanical systems. The air is pushed down, it's circulated, it's swirled around the room, so everybody's breathing the same air. It's moving sort of right to left across the space, and then being pulled back up into a plenum or a duct in the ceiling, and it's just pushing the air everywhere. So having the airflow directly up or directly down, so it's passing over each person's respiratory zone one time before going back into the system, is a change. Now that's going to change the infrastructure in the building, how it's distributed around the building. So there's some cost impacts. There's a little bit of a premium for new buildings, even more so if you're retrofitting. So looking for things like raised floors and how we integrate a raised floor, which now I can have, air coming from under the floor going straight up to the ceiling and out of the space immediately. So those are some of the challenges that will come along with that. And the third one is going to be on the filtration side of that, whether it's using UV light or other types of light to kill germs that are in the air as they're passing through the mechanical system. So once they've passed out of the space and they've moved through, what is the filtration going to look like? How are we going to clean that air so when it comes back into the space, it's not bringing back any infectious contaminants with it? And we know how to do those systems. We've been using them in hospitals in terms of things like humidification and cleaner air. We've used them in laboratories. We're talking internally how a lot of the technology used in laboratories, biological and chemical, where air quality is of critical importance because of the type of material you have in that space with you. Some of those ideas are now being brought over and looked at in the workplace environment.
No, well said. I mean, I would say over the last 10 years in this business cycle, at least in Pittsburgh, and I think other places of the United States as well, that we've done some business, you've certainly seen a flight to quality. And that really, a lot of it wasn't driven from the perspective of what you just talked about, the filtration system. And it's interesting to see landlords now finally start to look at that. Are you getting requests from landlords to sit down and talk about those things as part of the go-forward building design?
Yeah, we hear that actually a lot from our engineers that we work with. So they're probably getting those calls more directly if it's simply the units, but or we're getting calls from clients we have, looking for recommendation for an engineer or contractor, HVAC contractor, to look at their system.
That's great.
I actually have a question for Chris. Sam, if you don't mind. That's Chris. Sure. I thought what you were saying was fabulous, and I'm hearing similar things in terms of air filtration. Raised floors are actually not that popular here yet, but there's a few buildings that have them, and I think they have such tremendous benefit. It allows you to reconfigure the space more naturally because you've got some of the guts already underneath the floor, and then you can kind of switch out tiles. You've got data cabling under there, you've got the filtration under there, you've got you have the full HVAC system. How do you think that raised floors are going to evolve over time? Do you think that might become a new standard? And if someone is considering a net new build, like to your point, retrofits can be expensive, but if people are considering a net new build, would you recommend that they perhaps look at raised floors as a kind of a default mechanism for HVAC and for cabling?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of benefit with raised floors. Some of the challenges that you run into. So first, if we look at like the retrofit side, the challenges we run into is that it really occurs at a few places. One is going to be the head height. When you're taking the floor height away, if you could take everything that's in the ceiling above you and get it underneath you, then it's not that big of a deal, but that usually isn't the case. You still may have ducts or lights or things. So now you're kind of enclosing your space top to bottom, and you're taking a little bit of the, and everybody wants open ceilings and wide open space. So that's partially aesthetic, but it does impact, I think, how people feel in a room or in a space without that ceiling height. One of the big challenges occurs though at the stairs. So the existing stairwells, the top landing of the stair comes to where the floor is that you're going to work on, and you need your floor to drop down 18 inches or 2 feet. So we're going to have to, figure out some way to either create a small stair or a ramp to kind of get you up onto that raised floor. In a new building, you can design around that because you can have the floor plate lower than the stair landings where you come onto the stair, or where the elevator landing would open up onto the floor. Sometimes there's some hesitancy with building owners to do that because buildings last 30, 40, 50 years, and they're buying into that solution for a very long term. It's difficult to turn back from. So there's some challenges. That some of the other challenges would involve accessing the shafts where that mechanical equipment needs to come in and out, because maybe the openings traditionally are at the top of the shaft at the ceiling. So you have to create some new openings. And then the other part of it is that the floor system itself is more costly than, say, an ACT drop ceiling that you may see in a workspace. If you're in an open area like a big loft building, I know that a lot of robotics and tech companies like, maybe that works. You can if you have the space, you can use that as a solution.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great insight. So Joel, obviously you're a leader in the robotics space here in Pittsburgh. What are some of the things and some of the challenges that your constituents with the PRN have been faced with? What are some of the things that you've been hearing?
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's, I've really enjoyed sitting here listening to you, the experts, lay out all the issues and what some of the new considerations are. Just for the audience, if folks don't know, most recently I was CEO at a company in Pittsburgh called Robotics. When I joined, we were, less than 15 people. We were in a converted, storage facility, very low rent, and we would always adapt around the space or make our own changes to the space to adapt to our needs in true startup fashion. The company, I actually saw it at the stage where it was literally in a garage. And then we moved to this transition space. And then when we closed on a Series A and really needed to expand the size of the company and continue attract top talent, we looked for a new space, and it was announced, earlier this year, late last year, that we had moved into Robotics Row, in Lawrenceville. And we went from about 6,000 square feet to over 30,000 square feet. And about 9 of that was for, traditional conference room, employee desks, general office space. But the rest of it really was for testing. We are developing fully autonomous material handling robots that go into warehouses. So we had to set up a warehouse environment, supporting e-commerce picking applications. The units themselves are fairly large. And then all throughout the commercialization process, we needed space for pure research and development, testing, unit testing, system testing, and then we did some parts manufacturing on site, and we did some sub-assembly and final assembly, on site. So we needed a lot of the space. So what I've been hearing is, and I also want to comment on it's really good to hear that. I guess we can't overreact, but it's good to hear that companies are not overreacting because of some of the constraints that are in place. But it's also interesting to hear that we're going to, some of this will persist going forward. I think for anybody who's a functioning germaphobe, they're going to be happy for the touchless environment. For someone who's managing a workforce, this is a good thing. We've always been concerned about the health of our workforce, and we seem to just soldier on during flu season. And unfortunately, some people on important teams are either not available or they have to work from home, which was disruptive, especially when the understanding is that everybody was in the office. But equally bad was when someone soldiered through it and came into the office and infected a larger team. And we just dealt with this as a normal way of life, right? Cold and flu season, but now it has a much bigger meaning to us, especially, if it becomes an infectious disease that shuts down an entire economy. So it's not bad. And I don't know anybody else, but with masks and constant hand washing, knock on wood, haven't been sick this year. So maybe it's better that we find a way to be a little bit more healthy. Our companies having the hardware component have had an extra burden of dealing with this, right? Because you have to have people working on hardware. So what I've heard companies doing is having rotation schedules for their mechanical and hardware engineers. I've heard them taking home, doing prototyping, kitchen table prototyping, kitchen table, small or sub-assembly. It's not ideal. I don't think it is sustainable. But it's what they've been doing to adapt, in the near term. Everything that I've heard, I've also can attest that, companies are taking their existing space and they're pulling, one out of every 3 desks out or maybe half the desks, and coming up with a rotation schedule now that people are starting to come back into the office, a little bit more. Obviously, there's hand sanitizer in every conference room. There are mandates to wear masks, when you're indoors. I think all of the appropriate things that we need to be doing, as a community. I started my career out in the consulting world. Service-based businesses and global consulting firms have been doing hot desking and hoteling for decades. And so I do think that this can become a way to create a more dynamic, work environment. I think one of the lasting changes from this, and I've had debates of whether, we think people are going to go back into the office. Really interesting to hear the survey data and to see the trend in that data as well. It's not sustainable to be working, in this way fully. However, I think it'll be interesting that there are individuals have always had different ways of working at different times and being productive in different places. And so I like to hear that through phone booths or quiet or solo areas, or the ability to go off into a coffee shop. This now is going to be culturally acceptable within a company, because we've realized in 2020 that our companies are able to maintain their operations, and in some cases, and in the robotics space, they're actually thriving. COVID has actually accelerated the need for autonomous solutions and for automated solutions. And we have companies in Pittsburgh that are raising large sums of money. They're hiring actively. They're ramping up their businesses. I'll end on this for your question is that I do know some companies that are going to distributed offices and distributed, workforce. So one thing I would be interested in hearing from this panel is that you may be working with a company, that has, call it tens of employees or hundreds of employees in a single location, but now they're going to be fragmenting and distributing, their workforce. How are you advising them on those smaller offices? Perhaps maybe it's an office in Toronto, or Pittsburgh company sets up an outpost in San Francisco, or San Francisco companies, see the attraction to the talent in Pittsburgh and they're setting up small offices. You've got to have a more dynamic strategy, I would imagine.
Yeah, and Joel, and that's a great segue into our next topic, which is the distributed workforce. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm sure Chris and Elisa can certainly attest to this. The most dynamic companies in the world have had a work from home strategy, as long as I can remember. And the key word there is strategy, right? You have to be strategic about how you're going about doing it, particularly large enterprise level companies. The buzzword now is distributed workforce. Some of the largest tech occupiers have come out and said, this is what we're going to be doing going forward. And, they're developing and we're advising them accordingly to try and make that happen going forward. Because we've clearly found that, there's pros and cons, there's costs and benefits, right? And we're working to try and figure those out. So this is a two-part question, could be answered by anybody on the panel. So on that topic of the distributed workforce, we think about robotics firms, Joel mentioned that some firms are struggling because you actually have to have collaboration and some of the groups in the space working on the actual IP with the team. Alternatively, people are out in a distributed environment also being very successful. So how are some of your clients and decision makers thought about a distributed workforce? And then the second part of that, what actions have you collectively taken to help lay the groundwork and implement, this reimagined work environment?
I can take it first, perhaps. I think that so much of what Joel just said really resonated with me, honestly, and what we're hearing from some of our clients. And I think the hardware and robotics sector has those added complications of actually the physical presence, like physically needing to touch something, is a bit unique, right? I mean, when we think about tech as a default, we think more software. A lot of the people that are talked about in, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, who are adopting remote first strategies, they're software. So they have a little bit more flexibility to be remote than a hardware robotics company, and think that we all just need to recognize that simple truth. But the tech sector at large, I think you've also both mentioned this, Sam and Joel, is remote working was not, it wasn't foreign. I mean, a lot of these big technology companies had distributed work policies for a long time. What COVID-19 proved is that we need to be, as employers, much more transparent about what those policies are and have them very, very well documented. And now it's actually becoming a bit of a competitive recruiting tactic as well as to how much flexibility you're willing to provide to your employees. So that, I think, is a big change. And again, because I'm a very, very visual learner, I'm just going to quickly share my screen one more time because I have a slide that talks to this topic relative to kind of how employers are orienting. So I think within the tech sector, again, let's recognize that hardware and robotics is certainly unique. But when we're talking about distributed work, tech has definitely landed into two primary camps. One is that remote first camp. Media likes to call it work from home indefinitely. It does not necessarily mean no office, but by a default, these employers who are predominantly software technology have said to their staff, we support you. By default, you can work remote. But if you would like to come into the workplace, if you have a reason to come, we're going to provide you office space to do that. There's only a few exceptions on this page, namely GitLab, who historically has not operated with an office space. And then Dropbox, actually about 2 weeks ago, they came out with a pretty big announcement, which I was actually very surprised to hear. So Dropbox's new workplace strategy is called Dropbox Studios. And by default, they're going to be a virtual first organization. That's the term they're using. And if you have solo heads down work, you're not supposed to come into the office. So actually, I thought that was a bit extreme. They only want their offices, which are now going to be in only key hub locations, to be for collaboration and for client-facing opportunities. But with those exceptions, kind of GitLab and Dropbox, putting those to the side, the rest of these all support collaboration within the office, but they're just saying, we hear you, we want remote workers to feel understood. And so we want you to feel comfortable that as a default, that's okay. And then for the hybrid companies, which I think the vast majority of technology is going to fall within, especially groups like hardware and robotics, Facebook, the Google, Salesforce, Microsoft, that's where most technologies are going to sit. And what that means is they're going to have some distributed work policies for select employees, either employees who have gotten explicit manager approval and who don't need to physically be in the office, or they're going to allow a certain portion of the work week to be done remotely. Like Microsoft has said, there's up to a certain percentage of a work week you can do so remotely, or you can get explicit manager approval to work remotely indefinitely. I definitely think that transparent policies are incredibly important. Perhaps making those public, I think, can be a competitive recruiting advantage. And then maybe the last thing I'll mention, because it happens to be on the slide that I had used with another client, is that Mckinsey, to Joel's point, that a lot of great global consulting firms have been doing these things for ages. Mckinsey put out a great report a few months ago called Reimagining the Post-Pandemic Workplace. And they talked to a lot of the challenges and the benefits, the pros, cons of working in a distributed way. Some of the things that I certainly kind of honed in on in reading that report was things like mind the time zone gap. So if we are an employer who's supporting a newly distributed workforce, and it for some reason that works, that's the policy, we might still have to make some restrictions as to when the work week starts and ends. Because if some folks are moving cross country, removing all barriers, it can be really challenging collaboratively, logistically, to work with people who are 6, 8, 10 hours ahead in time. And actually, I heard this directly from several tech clients in the last few months. So we actually saw some technology employers already start to put restrictions on how far from a time zone kind of barrier people were allowed to relocate. And then the other interesting point that I'll close out on is that what McKinsey said around leaders needing to show up differently. So no matter what the policy ends up being, I think it's super important that the leaders adopt it. So if that means that we're allowing employees to work remotely 1 day a week, which I've heard, quite a lot here in the Bay, that, the leaders, they need to follow suit. Otherwise, those who take advantage of that policy are going to start to feel over time like they're missing out on something. Oh, perhaps if I'm taking that day away, that means I'm not, excelling, I'm not participating, I'm not leaning in. The leaders need to be able to kind of walk the line so people can look to them for their own comfort in what they adopt with regards to these new policies. And I'll leave it at that.
Chris, are you seeing anything from a space utilization perspective when it comes to distributed workforce?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a challenge following up on what Elisa said there. When you get down to the individual companies, the strategies are going to be, they're very specific to that industry and what they're trying to do. So we find ourselves in the role really of listening to how they want to operate and what their ideas are, and then developing the infrastructure around that. So some of the challenges we have initially that have come up are people are finding themselves working in virtual meetings in environments that were never really designed for that. So while, maybe let's say, for example, in a maker space, your team would come together, 3 or 4 people around a table, and they would work traditionally. Now you have one person in the room because you need someone physically there with whatever you're working on, and the other people are remote. So they have a camera and they have a laptop, and there's other people in the room with them. Acoustically, it's not a great space to be hosting a meeting. So you have a large open space. You may have somebody else either working on a piece of equipment in the background or running a piece of equipment. You have other people in the background that are in their own meetings. So yes, they're 6 feet, 12 feet away from you physically from a social distancing standpoint, but you can hear them and they're they're being picked up on your microphone and their microphone. So now you have a choice of relocating to a phone booth. As we just talked about it, so people are looking for different places where they can step into a room or somewhere where they can have a virtual meeting. But then again, like we were saying, they're not in the shop where they need to be. They're not in the right location. So that's certainly a challenge. The acoustics are a challenge. One of the other challenges is bandwidth and internet speed. Suddenly now everybody is on a meeting all the time. We see that at the residential level in our houses, but it impacts at the business level as well. When you're in a commercial environment, you need more WAP ports for wireless access. If you're running a process, or you have something that's, a 3D printer or something that's going, now you need to add a camera or something so you can see it remotely and watch it because you're not in the room with it as much. Every one of these devices, plus on top of that, you already had, the Internet of Things coming in, and the Wi-Fi capacity is really getting stretched and getting pushed. So, with the bandwidth is certainly an ongoing issue. As far as the type of spaces, again, kind of echoing what Elisa just said, about large collaboration spaces. That seems to be one of the main areas that's missing. There's less of concern about individual heads down workspaces, because you can get those elsewhere. You can have a hot desk or something like that. You can go home. But where can we collaborate in a way that is open, that is spaced out, that people can stand away from each other and still talk? And there's not as many of those spaces available. A lot of those large rooms may have been training or conference rooms or things that were intended for 50 people. Now there's 8 or 10 people using that same type of space. So I think that companies are looking for those type of spaces. Collaboration and client-facing opportunities are the reasons that they want that office to exist, and they need people there, and it will continue to exist. But seeing people, not constantly being on a Zoom meeting with them, and finding opportunities to do that.
Thanks, Chris. No, I think that's great insight as to what firms should think about when it comes to space utilization in their workplace, which is something that I think Lisa can attest to this too. I mean, that's one thing that we always have conversations with our clients. I mean, real estate's about people, place, and technology, right? It took us this long to figure this out, and the people part is very much on the utilization. So thanks for your insight there. So we're going to pivot here to the Q&A section. So this could be answered by anybody on the panel. Aaron Nicely has a question here. What are others doing when employees that must come to work and collaboratively work together in a lab or testing environment or in a manufacturing role and share machines or assembly areas?
So the question is, how are they,
what
are they approaching those shared environments?
Yeah, I mean, at high level, what are the employees, what are employers doing that have employees that must come into an office and collaborate in a lab or testing environment, or that are in a manufacturing role? What are we seeing out in the marketplace?
I think in the short term, they're reconfiguring the space as much as possible and trying to keep anyone who's not necessary to be in that space out of the space in a remote environment, viewing from either home or in a different part of the office, or reconfiguring and spacing out if there's to get people that 6-foot distance and they're having them wear masks.
I agree. And I would say, having toured a bunch of labs last week, I mean, what we're seeing tactically is temperature checks at check-in, a lot more restrictions for visitors. So kind of what Chris was implying, if employees need to be there, this is a space for employees. We're not having friends and visitors kind of coming through the space. So making sure that it's truly the people that need to be physically present who are present in a restricted area. Contact tracing is absolutely become more fundamental for those lab environments here. So if people are checking in, they're doing it in a digital fashion, whether it's a visitor management technology, something that makes it easier that if there was something, they were able to get in touch with everybody who visited the facility that day. And then increased kind of sanitation, whether it's sanitizer sprays. I've definitely seen that. The challenge is some equipment is more delicate than others in terms of what you can spray on it. But I think that's a case by case basis. And so there has definitely been increased kind of janitorial, and that has unfortunately mostly fallen on the tenants. Landlords, while they have increased their janitorial generally speaking, it is not so precise enough to address things like equipment in labs, since the tenants have taken on more of that burden.
Yeah, that's oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Chris. You can comment on that.
Yeah, I was going to say that that's a good point about the contact tracing. That is something we're seeing when people are checking into facilities. QR codes on the doors as you're walking in, just to scan it so they know who's there and when, and then also shifting the workforce. So instead of having people come in at the same time, trying to shift that through different parts of the day and break up people's schedules to reduce the number of people in a space at any one given time.
That's exactly what I was going to say, which is staggering schedules, shifting schedules, trying to compartmentalize the work to where you have fewer people, in those spaces. And what I've seen too is just doing their best, as already been noted, to reconfigure the space just to create more room, between different work cells or units of work. And then I would say I've seen people that are just going and buying aftermarket air purification systems, right? There's some science that shows that certainly helps, as a remediation effort. And I think it's just a, worthwhile, extra step, for making a safer environment.
And in addition, I think also, having sort of a team mentality about how we deal with ourselves from a health standpoint, self-quarantining when people are traveling, even within our office, recognizing that if you're working with a team of people and your whole team gets sick at the same time, that could be really devastating to your project you're working on, let alone the health consequences, but just losing, all of the members of the team. So, kind of protecting your teammates around you and making sure that, hey, if I've traveled or gone somewhere, maybe I need to sort of separate myself from the group and be sure not to expose anybody for the kind of greater good of the project you're working on with them.
I think it might be worth stating, to everyone, and I think we're saying this to each other all the time, but we still have to remain diligent. We're entering the winter months, and I know that we've gone through, this first shock period and then had to live with the reality this year. But by all accounts, it'll get worse before it gets better. And then hopefully we'll be on the other side of it, next year. I have been in spaces that have a lot of the safeguards in place, but you really just see some of the, the practices by individual employees starting to trail off. We're becoming fatigued by all of this. And so, in terms of keeping social distance within an office, I've seen that break down. In terms of wearing masks properly, I've seen that break down. We can only do so much from an infrastructure perspective. And you can have the policies in place, but then when you get into your daily work practice, it's very easy to fall back to what we're used to. So maybe just a little bit of an endorsement of, let's stay diligent here through the winter months, because we don't want to see any of our companies have to shut down, through any of this. The goal here is to continue moving forward with our business while keeping employees safe. I have a question, I think, for the panels, if I may, Sam, is,
Sure.
I'm real interested in the comment from Elisa about, I think you said it was Box or one of those, about the hubs that they were creating, just for workplace collaboration. I've also been looking at, what Autodesk had done with their build offices, which are meant to spur innovation, to encourage collaboration, not even within a company, but also with the community. And so you're inviting others in. And I know when I was at IAM, and I see this more and more in the robotics space, the office is not just a place for employees to work and execute their business plan and produce their products. They're also becoming showcases for customers and for partners and key influencers. And so, I'm real curious about, obviously it's hard to take visitors now. But what are you seeing that your clients are doing now in terms of setting up showcase space, and how do you think that'll become part of the norm going forward?
So this has definitely been a trend that has been actually started before we even came into the pandemic, was to showcase, especially with technologies, with Industry 4.0. So we've seen that for a number of years of wanting to establish, kind of going back to the science and tech realm, we call science on display, which has become tech on display, robotics on display, and really want to sort of sell these technologies and celebrate them. And we've seen a number of spaces designed that way, using a lot of glass. And that glass is usually to keep people out of certain environments they probably don't need to be in if they're a visitor. It's also for acoustic separations between the equipment, but it has something that we've seen for a long time. We're designing a building in New Kensington called the Next Innovation Center, and in that building they wanted to have basically a traditional almost storefront, neighborhood storefront that you would have saw for displaying any product. And that we have that very similar type of design where we're bringing the technology right up to the edge of the sidewalk where people can see it. They can walk around it. They don't even have to come into the building. They can, stand right out front and almost window shop, if you will. But we've seen that in a lot of environments, and I would imagine that will keep continuing, where you have a little bit of a, tour corridors and things like that, a lot of glass separating the technology from people coming through.
Yeah, and I just would echo what Chris said. I definitely also seen an increased interest in these types of showcases here in the Bay Area. And I had the pleasure of touring one of the Autodesk Innovation Labs last year, and it's a shame that, Bill, to your point, I can't imagine them taking me through at this juncture. I think most Bay Area businesses are very closed down to any sort of visitor engagement at this stage. But just thinking back to my Autodesk experience, it was still fairly regimented, right? I mean, you had to book a tour, there was a certain capacity to the tour. So logistically, outside of what Chris mentioned, which I absolutely think Chris is spot on, that's going to be the new standard glass, make it really strict. Just having better visitor management policies aided by technology, and there's certainly a lot out there.
Well, putting my host hat back on, wanted to see if there are any additional questions. I also encourage folks to share with us that things that you may be doing that we haven't discussed, something that's unique that we can highlight, for you. Or maybe we're all just trying to survive, day by day. I know as a leader, our first priority is having a viable product that's addressing a core need, finding customers, and ensuring success and putting that product in the marketplace. But following that, businesses' growth can be hampered by their facilities. It's very critical in terms of attracting today's technology worker. And now we're going to have this new conversation about not only are you coming to work for us, but where are you going to work for us, and how you're going to work for us, and what are the expectations there. So it's I think it's exciting. It's going to create new kinds of collaboration, not only within a company, but across a partner network, and allows us to, from a recruiting perspective, not have to always require that someone, relocate, and maybe even physically be close to an office that could be in one physical space, or another. And now we might be able to support them in other ways. Not seeing any questions right now. And I'm curious to see if there are any insights, maybe Sam and the panel, is there anything else that you can offer as suggestions for the Pittsburgh community that they could be doing? And then we'll see if we get some additional questions. And if not, we can start wrapping up.
Yeah, sure. Chris, I have a question. If Elisa and I are representing a robotics or a technologies firm, particularly in the more of the light manufacturing maker type space, we came to you to talk about devising a strategy for not only distributed workforce, but mainly space utilization. What's the first question you would ask our client, or what's the first piece of advice you would give them?
Well, I think that the first thing we would want to ask is to have them kind of walk us through their process. So it's more than probably a single question. We want to gather as much information as we can before making any recommendation. So we would want to hear what their process is, how they operate, how they're going to see it changing, and sort of really get our heads wrapped around and understand what it is that they're trying to achieve, whether it's a distributed workforce or any of these other strategies they want to implement. Then from there, the next question is, where are you going to do this? So is it in your existing space? Are you looking for a new space? And what we need to analyze on our end is, obviously the space needs, but also does the building or the space you're looking at have the infrastructure to support what you're trying to do? So this is kind of the puzzle that we're putting together in the beginning. So if let's say you want to have a highly virtual environment, you want to be able to operate things remotely from a distance, you want to have a distributed workforce, and you need to have a lot of cameras on the floor, or you need to have a lot of automation and things like that. So developing, making sure that you have the right internet, that you have the right power in the building to do what you want to do. We sometimes will tour spaces prior to purchase or prior to leasing with them to say, okay, we sat down, you explain what you want to do. We've identified some of your challenges. Let's say your challenge is that you need a lot more power than a traditional office building would have. So we need to look at spaces that have that power. Maybe it is in more of an old manufacturing space that we want to convert into a flex tech robotics environment with office. So understanding what they're doing and then making sure they're in the right space so they're not spending unnecessary capital on upgrades.
Well, so we have a saying in our office start early and often, as Elisa and Chris would both attest to, that process can take 24 months, right? So it's depending on scope and size and complexity of the requirement. So it takes a lot of thoughtful design and strategic development to get the best outcome. So I do have another question here from John Michaels. Are clients investing in the increased cost of infrastructure in order to provide the flexibility to move functions more easily from space to space? For example, providing 220 or 440 in rooms that would not necessarily have had it before. In reference to, I'm assuming, power there.
I could answer that one.
Sure, please.
I would say yes and no. So there is some amount of investment in flexibility. So in thinking of what may need to be in a space in the future, but typically as opposed to distributing, let's say 480 power, if they don't have that need on day one, we would look at really the service coming into the building and make sure that things are upgradable for the future. So this is a really, I think this is kind of the really tough question for a lot of, especially growing companies to deal with. They know what they need on day one. They kind of know where they're going long term, but the technology itself is changing rapidly. So if we're planning and designing a building that's going to be built 2 years from now, that technology will change. If they're if they're in the tech space, that's going to keep changing every year they're in the building. So you start to try to walk this line between how much do you invest initially versus how much do you leave as sort of flex, open space, adaptable type of services such as power, realizing that some of those type of upgrades will require building permits, will require renovations, and some of them won't. So this is a strategic thing that we work with a client and really kind of get into detail with them about how they operate and where they're going to be in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And then, we'll lay out the different scenarios. Here's the different upgrades we would have to do. Maybe scenario A, we have to do this much, or we have a B and a C, right? So we may have different levels. We'll have those priced by an estimator or a contractor. And then we give them information to work with. How much do they want to invest now in that infrastructure? How much do they want to defer down the road? Understanding the risks, understanding the timing that's involved in different levels of renovation. So I think really informing them is the key point with that.
I have a somewhat related question, or at least it brought up a quick question. Having a good architectural plan, having a good real estate strategy, I find to be strategically important for businesses. For early stage companies, it can be an expensive proposition, especially very frugal entrepreneurs, that have a hard time spending in some in these areas. I think that we're proving the value of making those investments. But early on, what are some low-cost ideas or low-cost strategies that companies can employ to start down this path?
So things that I feel like we saw very early were just simple panels, like to separate furniture from each other, whether that's felt panels that is sold by a particular furniture vendor that is compatible with a particular set of desks, or plastic shields and plastic barriers. That I feel like happened very quickly. And maybe some of that is public theater, but I do feel like I'm assuming it provides at least some barrier, right? And then we certainly are seeing employers purchase company branded masks just to ensure that there is no lapse. Because I think, Joel, to your point, I mean, we can do all that we can, but if individuals don't take it seriously and adapt, then it's all for naught. So definitely see company branded masks out here in the Bay. And those are things that don't take an incredible amount of investment, but actually have a lot of payback for folks. So I would say that those two tactics are low cost and pretty impactful.
This is a question we get a lot. It comes up. So it's pretty normal for us to sort of address this, and it really comes down to what they're trying to achieve within a certain space. So we've met with clients where we've consulted with them in one meeting, and we didn't need to do any further work from that, or we do a very small renovation project, which we don't mind that at all, because especially with entrepreneurs, because that company is growing, and we really enjoy the opportunity to kind of build a relationship, understand where the company's going, sit down and have a conversation about it, maybe put together some very initial plans at a very low level to get them a building permit and get them into a space so they can start to work and maybe create that flexible environment that you're talking about, Joel, where they can, or at least you can put up plastic shields or move things around. The flexible work environment is probably the best solution for that. Get yourself set up with the right infrastructure, the right power, the right data, restrooms, kitchenette, the basics that you need, and give you an open floor plate to work with that you can grow within.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a phase of early stage companies where they do all this on their own, right?
Sure.
And sometimes haphazardly, and that's okay. That's the nature of a garage, based company. But eventually, you want to start turning to professionals and go through that transition to avoid, to start limiting your liability, and also start coming up with competitive configurations that make you more competitive, for talent, in the marketplace. Sam, I'll turn it to you. We got another question, and then maybe we could start our wrap up.
That works. So from Kim H, based on your conversations with your prospective clients, what is your pulse on when companies may make decisions on how they will be adjusting their space needs going forward? Then we can all answer that. I have similar or different answers. I think to Joel's point earlier, when you look at the corporate life cycle, emerging tech versus enterprise level firms, they're operating at a different wavelength. So I think the answer to Kim's question is it depends. I think what we're seeing right now with mature enterprise level companies, if there's a real estate event in the short future, they have a lot of employees, depends on the critical needs or what the business unit does. That's the first thing to look at. But they're certainly, I think, punting real estate, at least leasing decisions, out a year, maybe 2 years, depending on their relationship with the landlord. I would say, and locally here and in some other markets we do some work in, the small to medium-sized business space is certainly more active for reasons based on, again, the business that they're in. But I would say still, I can't really put a predictor on it until, first things first, we have to have stabilization in the economy, and that only comes in the form of, a vaccine. So.
The only thing that I would add is that a large cohort of technology companies, and mind you, they are predominantly in the software side, are predicting summer 2021 workplace reentry. I mean, that's kind of the benchmark right now. So a lot of companies that I have been working with are planning on making changes first quarter and second quarter of 2021 to anticipate that return. I mean, they're expecting people to return. That, in fact, their offices are technically open in many cases for essential employees. So they've already had to do some retrofitting. I don't think that they're going to kick the can down the road much further beyond second quarter 2021, unless some other catastrophe occurs, because they do want to be prepared when employees come back to the space.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that we see a lot of people targeting quarter one next year, and I think part of the reason has to do with the summer 2021. People think that that's going to kind of be the daylight we're going to see, but also in terms of companies' budgets, the 2020 has been a tough year, and money's been focused in other directions toward other things, and I think as they're planning the 2021 year, they're starting to look at that as a kickoff point to start moving forward.
Yeah, I think to kind of close that thought up. I mean, that's what was really critical about having some type of comprehensive real estate strategy, right? It's understanding the levers you can pull with the landlord, with design, with your bank, with the landlord's bank, to figure out the most optimal solution for your business. And it takes, again, time, process, strategy to develop these things. So.
Okay. Any parting thoughts or anything else the panel wanted to mention?
One of the things that I would add is that we should expect, and I'm anticipating that we will see some things in terms of codes and legislation changing. So health departments may increase their mandates on how spaces or how bathrooms are configured in certain environments. Those things tend to move a little slower. Same with the building codes. We'll start to see some building code adaptation to whether it's indoor air quality, just like we saw with energy consumption as the code slowly started to ramp up and push the industry a certain direction. So I think we will be seeing things like that starting to come down the pipe over the next couple of years.
Okay, Sam, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and wrap us up.
Sure.
And I want to just thank Kim, who just asked that question. That was a very important question for us to address, because companies should be thinking about this today. And if you're making any kind of physical renovation or any new build outs, we could see what the lead times look like. So at this, Sam, I really want to thank you and the team at Cushman and Wakefield for setting up this webinar. It is really important. Some people might intuitively know about it, but haven't had the time, to think about it in more detail. So I see a number of our rapidly growing companies who are in the audience. So I'm really appreciative that we had a chance to have this conversation. And Elisa and Chris, thank you so much for sharing, your experiences and bringing your expertise to bear. To the audience, we've recorded this session. We will make it available for later viewing if you want to go back and reference any of the content. If you want to be in touch with anybody, any of our panelists, feel free to come to the PRN. I'd be happy to make those connections. I'm sure these folks would like to make your acquaintance and help where they can. We could be contacted at our email address, which is info@robopgh.org. I mentioned our website earlier, which is robopgh.org. And then our Twitter handle is largely the same, at robopgh. And I really encourage you, if you're new to the Pittsburgh community or new to our robotics community, please reach out. This is all about being aware of what's happening here, making the right connections. We are one of the top robotics communities in the world. We're producing a lot of innovation, and we're beginning to commercialize that in many different sectors. And I'm very thankful for these types of sessions and getting to know experts like our panel today, because it's crucial to helping build a successful company and accelerate our goals as quickly as possible. And Lisa, to you representing all of those on the West Coast, thanks for getting up early this morning. Hope everybody has a good and productive day. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.